アメリカにおられる皆様、こんにちは。また日本の皆様、おはようございます。第3回の本日は、スピーカーとしてアニオプレックス社プレジデントのデバンさん、インタビュアーとして筑波大学教授の小柳さんをお迎えしております。日本の拠点都市のですね、関心分野の一つであるライフサイエンスを例に取り上げまして、アメリカのエコシステムの構造、エコシステムがワークするための重要な要素、そして日本のエコシステム形成のインプリケーションを議論していただきます。視聴者の皆様は Q&A 機能を使って質問を送ることができます。レイズハンドにはお答えできませんのでご注意ください。ここからの進行は英語で行いますが、本日は日本語への同時通訳を用意しております。画面の右下に地球のマークのインタープリテーションと書かれたアイコンがあります。日本語の通訳が必要な方は、そのアイコンをクリックし、日本語を選択してください。このまま英語で聞かれたい方は、操作は不要です。それでは早速、小柳さんにバトンタッチします。ここからは英語になります。小柳さん、自己紹介も兼ねてモデレートをお願いいたします。
Hi, thank you very much, Yamashita-san, for the nice introduction. My name is Tomo Koyanagi from University of Tsukuba. I'm a professor at the School of Medicine, but at the same time, I'm in charge of the entrepreneurship training in the life science area, and I'm covering the all Japan. By the way, it's my pleasure to get a chance to make interview Devon, and we got to know like 5 years, and also as a part of the Spark at Stanford, Devon is one of the major mentor of that program, and I'm running the Spark Japan side, so we are already working a lot. So by the way, I myself used to be trained at Stanford University for 5 years, and then I came back to Japan and spent like 10 years in the startup community in the biotech area in Japan. So through that experience, I know some idea about what a Japanese ecosystem should be, but at the same time, I have to learn from Devon about the US ecosystem. So today, I want to ask Devon to have some short presentation, including his introduction, and then we'll get into the discussion. And even during the presentation discussion, please enter any questions which you want to ask Devon about the ecosystem, or what's the difference between Japan, US, biotech, high tech, something like that. Okay, so Devon, could you start your presentation and including your introduction?
Yeah, sure. Let me put this share screen, right? And then into the slideshow. There. Okay. Can you see the first slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So just to start, let me start by saying that I'm really happy to be here. It's a great honor, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Yamashita-san, for putting this together. And it's really fun to be able to be here with my friend Tomo. It's weird calling you Tomo because I feel like the gravity of the situation requires a Koyanagi sensei. But and then to everybody who's watching, Tomo is very humble, but really I feel like I have a lot to learn from him actually as well. And he's a really key figure in the ecosystem in Japan and doing a lot to advance bioventure in Japan. So it's really great to be able to talk with him today and have a good discussion. So about me, I guess just a brief self-introduction. My name is Devon. People in Japan call me Deban. Deban no Deban desu. It makes it easy to remember. I did my PhD at UCLA and I was studying gene therapy and neuroscience. I then did a postdoc at Kyoto University in Japan, the Saisei Ryo Kenkyujo, and it was right around the time that the iPS cells came out of there. So it was very exciting, and that's where my connection with Japan started. I came back to the US And I did another round of postdoc at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital and Department of Veterans Affairs in Boston. Then I got out of academia. I joined the US Patent and Trademark Office. I was a patent examiner for 10 years. And I'm currently a patent agent. I also have been running a consulting business for quite some time, doing research consulting, strategic, technical business advisory. And I work with startups, I work with large corporations, I work with venture capital firms and universities in the biotech, life sciences, and healthcare related space. So that's what I do. And I recently started at a startup here in the Bay Area called Turn Biotechnologies. I'm the vice president of intellectual property there. And we are an mRNA therapeutics company doing interesting things. So it's very exciting. So that's me. And I will start, I have some slides that I want to use to frame the discussion today. So I know that a lot of people who are watching are not necessarily from the bio world. So I want to first outline BioVenture and what it's for and how it works. So usually in the BioVenture world, the innovation is coming from universities, university professors, university researchers. They make new discoveries and then seek to commercialize those discoveries. And so traditionally, the idea was that those discoveries would just be licensed from a university into a large company. But recently, to facilitate the commercialization, the discoveries get licensed to a startup, which might or might not involve that the professor, who usually ends up being a scientific founder of the startup. And then the startup grows and develops the technology, and then eventually either licenses it to a large company or it's acquired, or the startup gets acquired by a large company. And so what the university gets out of this is the commercialization of the technology. So they can get equity in startup companies. They get royalties, milestones, the same way as if they directly licensed the technology to a large company. The startup gets value creation. So it's a way for investors to create value. And it's also a way actually that the original researchers, the inventors, can be rewarded as well. And the large corporations, and this is the interesting part, is they are moving towards externalizing their innovation. So this can be a way that large corporations that have difficulty in innovating or are stagnating can pull in outside innovations and make a new drug pipeline. And so that's the essence of BioVenture. So in doing BioVenture, the big things that should be considered, and all of the ecosystem components are actually in one way or another geared towards de-risking these factors, but there are these risk factors here that have to be considered. One thing that's kind of unique about BioVentures is that it's very technology dependent. I mean, if the technology doesn't work, then that's an issue. And so a big part of de-risking goes to figuring out how to de-risk the technology. The team is another big factor, whether or not the team can execute. And I think that's common to all startups, not just bio. And funding. Biotech, life sciences is very capital intensive. It uses a lot of money. And if there's not enough money to make things happen, it can force a lot of tough business decisions and make things difficult. And so in trying to address these risk factors, there's several models for startups that have emerged recently, or I guess more on the recent, well, I guess not so recently. So one model that took shape some time ago is the idea of prove, build, scale. So the idea is, okay, go out and very cheaply and quickly obtain the proof of concept that you need to get people to really buy into what you're doing. And so what this utilizes is a lot of outsourcing. And so we've seen incubators arise where people don't have to build their own laboratory. They can just go into an existing laboratory and start doing experiments using a lot of part-time staff, outsourcing experiments. It's almost come to the point where sometimes you see biotech companies that are almost virtual companies. There's a core technology in the founders, and then everything else is outsourced. And so getting that proof of concept, the idea is that it can de-risk the future growth. And so usually investors will not come on board and put larger money in that's going to be required to actually do the clinical development until there's some kind of proof of concept. So this prove, build, scale is really, it's all about the proof of concept. And recently, what has really emerged, and probably all the famous companies, or a lot of the famous companies that are coming out now or making big news now, are using these models. And it's kind of a variation on the same thing. So I put them together: venture studio, in-house venture creation, build to buy. And the essence of it is that a VC or a large corporation, a corporate, they're the ones who are going out and founding or growing startups. They have an idea of what they want to do, and they'll go out and they'll assemble the technology they need, they'll assemble the team that they need, and they'll put money into it. And so this helps with de-risking because it's a market-driven approach. The VCs and the corporates are starting at the end, where the startup, they know that the startup needs to go, and then working back from there. And so it involves a lot of planning, maybe even more than a typical startup. They have everything planned out to a great extent from the very beginning, from even before the startup is founded. They carefully select the management so they can bring in experienced managers. There are people who they have worked with for a long time. A lot of times when the VCs are doing it, you'll see people from the VC being the founding CEO or founding CSO or founding CTO or whatever executive team is needed. Then some companies or some VCs that run this kind of a system, they also actually have a pool of management talent. And so they can deploy them and send them to a company for a while, and then pull them out and put them into another company. And that actually de-risks it for the managers, because even if the company that they're working for fails, then they can just go into another one of that VC's companies. And so they provide funding to get the proof of concept. And this is different from an equity investment. I mean, it's an investment, but I mean, it's different from the typical equity investment that you think about when you're looking at other kinds of VC models. Where someone comes and pitches to them, and then they say, okay, I need some, you gave me proof of concept, so now, I'm going to give you money. Here, it's more that there's an idea, it seems interesting, they'll pay out some money to test it out, to kick the tires, as people say colloquially, right? And once they're confident that there's something there, then these companies will launch with pretty huge money, right? Some of the VCs and companies that are doing this have made news with companies launching with hundreds of millions of dollars at launch. And so then that is growth funding that provides a runway that these companies can then use to grow with the validated technology. And they can keep on doing technology development. They can also use that money for in-licensing and continuing to build out their technology platform. So it can be very versatile. And so a lot of companies that you hear in the news in the biotech sector these days that are having big successes have started using this kind of system. I think this kind of system has really emerged over it's made a lot of news over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that this is a direction that BioVenture is going. And so I think with that, I was going to talk maybe a little bit about the different aspects of de-risking for each of those categories, right? Technology, people, funding. But I think we can just maybe start the discussion. Tomo, what do you think?
Okay, thank you very much, Devon, for the nice introduction to getting to the discussion. And I pick up some important keyword from your introduction. Sounds like the externalization of the innovation, or like a de-risking. Is the kind of already general in other field too. But in the biotech area, the capital intensive, so we have to put a lot of money at the beginning and spend like 5 or almost like 10 years until the commercialization of the product itself. So those kind of things has to be discussed. And the new things, the venture studio and the in-house venture creation, those kind of things are quite new, and probably Japanese people don't know that much. So I want to deep dive after that. So what do you think? Can we start from the how the? Yeah, I realized that you didn't mention about for the build scale in phase. You didn't mention about angel investors.
Right.
So how does that different from the previous, or like 10 years ago? I guess the part used to be covered by angel investors or like serial entrepreneurs. But what is difference, and why it's why it came to the more about the systematic model? Do you have any?
I mean, the angel investors are still active. There's still a lot of angel investors, and they provide a critical layer for funding. But I think, first of all, I mean, people can raise significant money from angel investors. Even a regular angel round in the US, I think can be similar to a Series A round in Japan. And then some people actually raise rather large angel rounds that maybe can be equivalent to like Series B in Japan. But even then, it's not necessarily enough money to really give a long runway. But yeah, the traditional idea, right, was that angels provide that first layer. They're usually more risk tolerant than VCs. So when someone has that very early seed idea, and maybe they don't have enough proof of concept for a VC, they'll pull in angel money and then use that money to work at getting the proof of concept enough that VCs can then come on board. And so in that sense, this prove, build, scale ecosystem where you have incubators to let you do experiments cheaply, and you have virtualization, I think has kind of emerged in concert with that kind of funding. But, the angel investors, so they provide money, and a lot of them they're serial entrepreneurs, or they have an entrepreneurial background and expertise. So they provide really helpful advice and work closely with the companies to help them to grow. But sometimes I think with these venture studios, it can be more of a whole package where, the venture, the VC or the corporate is actually they're making the company. And so maybe actually that's one distinction to draw, right? Here, these guys they're forming the company. Whereas for an angel investor, usually somebody is going and pitching a company to the angel investor, and then they're going to invest in a company. So I think from that perspective, getting this kind of whole more holistic effect where the the VC or the corporate doing this kind of venture creation model, they're putting in managers, then managers who they know, and they control the management. They also, rather than waiting for somebody to come and pitch a technology to them, they're going out and finding the best technology that they want to use, and they're combining multiple technologies together to address the market need that they perceive. And they're starting from looking at it from the market and then figuring out what they want to do to address a problem or a market. So I think in that sense, it's a different approach, right? The angel investor, usually they have their meetings. People who want money from them will go and pitch to them. And then their deal flow is what comes before them. So I think in that sense, it's maybe a greater de-risking, maybe, that it can be achieved by using this kind of venture studio model. And then a lot of times too, right, it's done in conjunction with a corporate who could be the end either acquirer or partner. So there's that aspect also. So I think, the de-risking that is possible is more. And so that's why you see these companies with very rapid growth that's made possible by these kind of new models.
Okay, yeah. The venture studio model is relatively big. So let us start from since this is the ecosystem talk. So what about to start from the accelerator incubator discussion, since we're working in the Spark program, and then go back to the venture studio model, the actual examples of the venture studio after that.
Okay.
So, can you explain a little bit about how does the accelerator or incubators and what type and how the academia is involved in the acceleration program itself?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. So just to kind of define them, right? And everybody has different ways of looking at these and defining them. But the way I like to think about it is that accelerators are going in and giving really hands-on mentoring. And usually they have some kind of like a fixed program. And incubators, it's more like a rented lab space where you can go there to get the proof of concept. So I think that's a very broad in a broad stroke how to define those. So at least looking at the Bay Area ecosystem in this area, looking at the active incubators and accelerators, I think for accelerators, so for I guess you could call them for profit. I don't know, but basically accelerators that are not really affiliated with the university. Probably the most famous ones around here are IndieBio and Y Combinator. And IndieBio is focused on life sciences, biotechnology, whether it's for therapeutics, diagnostics, synthetic biology, food technology, whereas Y Combinator does everything. And so they have a several month-long program. They put in a little bit of seed funding, and then they take equity from the company. And so IndieBio also provides some lab space. Some of the companies use it more than the others. And so they actually, I think they charge rent out of the seed money that you get for them to use the lab space. And so the equity aspect is interesting because it aligns the accelerator with what the company is trying to do. So, if the company succeeds, then the accelerator succeeds more. These accelerators are backed by funds. So not only are they doing that seed funding, they'll also follow on and do follow-on funding a lot of times into their companies. Like, for example, IndieBio is part of SOSV, which is a large VC. But basically what they do is you go in there to that program and they teach you how to pitch, how to formulate your research and your science more into a business idea. And they teach scientists how to be business people. On the other side, you've got the incubators. And so corporate incubators like J Labs and just a regular incubator like NBC Biolabs. And so what that is they have a large lab space. Companies go in there for a couple of years. They pay rent. They can get access to shared lab equipment, and they can go in there and do experiments and start collecting that proof of concept data that they need to start attracting investors. And where these kinds of systems came out from is originally it used to be that even just starting out, just to get data, you needed huge capital expenditure because lab equipment and labs cost a lot of money. And so you need huge capital expenditure just from the very beginning, even before you even start getting proof of concept. Whereas here, the idea is that by using a shared lab space, you can get the proof of concept while you still have relatively low funding, and then use the proof of concept to pull in larger funding. And these companies, there's been quite some success out of that. NBC Biolabs has an affiliated fund, but they don't. Well, I don't know how much I would say affiliated, but the people who run NBC Biolabs also run a fund. They don't invest in that many of the companies that go through there, but they do invest in some of those companies. J Labs is run by Johnson & Johnson, they have sites now around the world. And I saw a quote from one of their executives saying that in one way or another, 25% of the companies that go through there end up in some kind of a deal with Johnson & Johnson, whether it's investment or an R&D funding, R&D agreement. With J Labs, I know that investment, they actually don't invest in that many of the companies. But so that's the other end. This is an incubator where the company is not getting any really hands-on support from the incubator. They're just going there to have a lab space to do their proof of concept. QB3 is interesting because it was actually a program of the state of California where they wanted to make a relationship between the universities, in this case, UC San Francisco, UC Berkeley, and UC Santa Cruz, and the state government of California and industry stakeholders. And so they've put that together basically into an incubator. They have some associated programs, but I think basically it serves as an incubator. And then as a university, I guess I would call it an accelerator, but there's Spark, right? Which at Stanford, which I'm involved with. And of course, you do Spark Global and Spark in Japan. And in that case, it's not only about startups. It's the main idea is to take basic research that's being done at Stanford and make something out of it, whether it's commercialized through licensing or through a startup, or just it could be something that they want to take from being a basic research into being some kind of a medicine and putting it through a clinical trial, or some kind of, it could be a nonprofit organization or whatever it is. And so what it is it's most of the teams that go through there, they receive a grant for 2 years to help support the research. And then there's weekly meetings where mentors from the surrounding community give feedback to the teams and also give some seminars so they can learn about all kinds of different things that you need to know when doing bioventure, whether it's IP or regulatory things like how to deal with the FDA or some parts of what kind of experiments that you need to do to collect data, things like that. And so the teams get feedback and they make a target product profile. And it goes from them just having a interesting basic science to then making an idea for an actual product. And then whether that becomes out licensed or becomes a startup or becomes a nonprofit organization or just goes to try to take it to a clinical trial, whatever it is, that's the goal. So the goal there is to translate university innovation into something that actually impacts the world.
Can I ask something about the size of the investment until obtaining the proof of concept? Because I want to give some image of what kind of activity is needed before launching the company itself. Something like the size of the gap fund and the target of the gap funding. And the proof of concept, my understanding for example, like drug discovery, like animal study, and how the efficacy improvement using animal model or something like that. And in Japan, probably 100,000 to 200,000 US dollars will be funded by AMED. What do you think in US? Is that similar, or a much bigger amount of money is needed for that?
It depends. One thing is it depends on also what you're doing, right? So in order for people to get excited about it, if you are doing the same kind of drug or nothing so unique, but it might really work well, then you're going to have to get more proof of concept and show how well it works. Whereas if it's something that is a really new modality or new technology that people have never seen before, and they say, wow, then you might need less proof of concept to get on board. But in terms of, in terms of university, so there's various sources for, I guess, if you're talking about AMED, there's various sources of government funding in the US. Usually people, when they want to commercialize through a company, they'll get what they call SBIR or STTR grants from the government. And those could be anywhere from the hundreds of thousands of dollars to, like a couple million, like a million or so. And in terms of, sometimes people will pull in like that kind of 100 or a couple $100,000s of dollars from a friends and family round that comes even before an angel investment round, sometimes pull in that kind of money from angels. Theoretically, it's that amount of money. If you use an incubator and do extensive virtualization, it might be enough to get some proof of concept. But the question is, if it's something really exciting, it might be possible to pull in more money even earlier. Actually, from that perspective, I think something that's interesting is, let's see, where did I put it? Oh no, wait a minute. Oh, I had it in here. I had a slide in here. So there was there's an example of a university company, or a university-based company from Stanford called 47, right? And that was from Professor Weissman's lab. Oh. And right, and well, him and I blanked on the name of the other professor. Actually, was really the other professor that he was in the hematology. He's a hematology researcher, and I had a slide on it, and for some reason I think maybe this is the different slide deck. But anyway, so what they did is they had this research, and so this hematology professor is studying cancer, and Professor Weissman is a stem cell researcher. And so, as you know, right, cancer is kind of the flip side of stem cells. And they found that there's this one signal in cancer cells that the cancer cell says, don't eat me. And so the idea was, maybe if you make an antibody drug against that, then you kind of demask cancer cells and they won't be able to evade the immune system as well. And so this discovery was made. Now, Professor Weissman is a very well-known figure in the stem cell world. And so the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine, which is our state agency that funds stem cell research, they put in significant money even before there was a company or anything like that, I think they put in about $30 million into funding this research because they thought it was very promising. And I think that, so they had originally published 2 papers based on this in 2009. And then this research was, picking up. I think they got the funding from CERM in I think 2013, something like that. 2014, based on that money from CERM, they filed an IND, which is an investigative new drug application with the FDA, and then started to get set up for a phase 1 clinical trial. Then the company was founded after that. So by the time the company was founded, they already had enough data that they had collected using grant money that they were able to do an IND filing. And in that sense, that really de-risks the concept. And so the company launched, I think either in 2015 or 2016, and they had I think 2015, and they had a 75 million Series A that they launched with. And then the same year, they raised another 75 million in Series B. And then they IPO'd, I want to say in 2018, I don't know. I think it was about around that time. And I think that when they IPO'd, I don't know, maybe around that $400 or $500 million valuation. I can't remember off the top of my head. But then the interesting thing is then they were recently, either I think this year or last year, acquired by Gilead for $4.9 billion. So it's an interesting way to go. And actually, Daria from Spark, who's the founding professor from Spark, who also has kind of a similar story to some extent about spinning out a innovation from a university to make a startup. But she often advocates, using those kind of university resources and using these kind of resources to build proof of concept. So then you are de-risking it for potential investors who then come on board afterwards. And so the interesting thing from there was, I think that Professor Weissman made, I think, like $190 million from the acquisition by Gilead. The other professor, I think he had like $130 million or something like that. But it's an interesting way to go for how innovation can be spun out of a university. And actually, I think that also that example highlights one other interesting thing to think about is in bioventure, IPO is not really, it's an exit because the investors, then their investment is liquid. But it's not really thought of as an exit. It's more that it's another funding round to get money for clinical trials, usually. And that's why actually in the space, quite often, well, I don't know quite often, but it's not uncommon to see that kind of activity, a post IPO acquisition. So then a large pharma goes in and acquires this public company, which is what happened with 47. I think a couple of other examples of that. Anacor is one example. So this was also.
Before that, can I explain a little bit
more
about how the Weissman get money from that? So
right.
simply the acquisition made by Gilead was 4.9 billion, which means the percent in Japanese, almost like that. And Weissman has like a 4.2% of the share. Simply, I would say 5%, which means that probably he already get like a $250 million valuation of the. I'm not sure that he's already sold everything, but the valuation itself is something like that. So once university professor started a company in 2015, and 6 years later or 5 years later, after that, he got $250 million. So that's the dynamics of the ecosystem around the Stanford University, right? Okay.
I don't know if he actually got 250, but but I know that what he ended up getting out of the acquisition was 190. So yeah, he had equity, right, like founder equity in the company, and then when the company went public, then that becomes stock, right, in the public company. And then when the large pharmaceutical company goes and buys out that public company, then yeah, it gets cashed out there. But yeah, I think those kind of things, yeah, in the Bay Area. So not only Stanford, right, but in the Bay Area, in Boston, those kind of things happen. Actually, can we talk about Bob Langer for a second? If in that context, sure, of yeah. So yeah, so Bob Langer is a really famous, he's one of the most famous scientists in the US. He's an institute professor at MIT. He was actually my boss at Kyoto University. He was my boss's mentor. And then when I was at Harvard, my lab had a collaboration with his lab. But he's a real pioneer in drug delivery and regenerative medicine. He basically started the field of tissue engineering by him and somebody else. They proposed that you can combine cells with factors and a scaffold to engineer tissues. And so, he's just this really prolific inventor. So he has over 1,400 patents either issued or pending. They've been licensed to more than 250 companies. He himself has founded more than 40 companies. And so he was one of the 3 scientific founders of Moderna. And actually, when we talk about a venture creation model, it's really interesting how Moderna got started in that kind of model. So I don't know if you want to jump to that next, but yeah, so it's similar to what happened with Professor Weissman at Stanford. So here, right, he had equity in Moderna, both as a founder and then as a board member. And then when Moderna went public, I mean, I don't know, how much, what he's sold or whatever, but at least his net worth right now is listed at like $3.5 billion. And I know last year I think Moderna has taken off more since then, but last year his stake in Moderna was hit more than $1 billion. So when it comes to entrepreneurship by faculty and professors in the university ecosystem, yeah, he's the example that everybody looks to because he's done so much. And he'll usually, so he'll make a company and then staff it with people from his lab or something like that. And so yeah,
one thing I want to know is that he is the genius guy and big impact to the society. But I think this is my guess. He's not working to make money. He wants to create something valuable in the scientific side or technology side. Eventually that turned into that big amount of money because he gave the so big impact to the society. So those kind of mentality, what do you think? You also know the Japanese scientist. Is that similar or a little different? What do you think?
I think it's similar. It's similar and different at the same time. So yeah, I don't think that people doing the really top scientific minds like this that are doing these kinds of things, yeah, I don't think they're motivated by money. For him, my understanding is that he really wants to make an impact in society and make things that really help people. But what I think it is then the system is set up in a way to maybe to better reward those kind of people. I mean, I do see plenty of faculty at Stanford who, okay, they're not financially driven, but when you start talking about doing a startup with them or something, then they get very excited. So yeah, so I'll put it this way. Okay, a guy I know, who runs an incubator here, he had this one saying that always sticks in my mind. He says, when the first Ferrari shows up in the university parking lot, Then,
Yeah.
all of the professors notice. So yeah, but the system. So of course, when they're doing this innovative basic research that leads to these wonderful inventions that change our world and change our society, of course, they're not thinking about getting rich, right? But the system, I think, here is set up to reward innovators and reward people who do that at multiple levels. And in Japan, sorry, go on.
Yeah, that's the big keyword. So ecosystem is not driven to create the ecosystem. Ecosystem have been created to reward, first contribute to the society, big impact to the society, and then provide a feedback, the reward to the inventors or other key people who made big effort toward
right. And so when you look at it, so Professor Langer, he has these 4 elements to biotech venture success, right? The idea that things, you start early and think big. You want to make a big societal impact because that's what gets, that's what makes a difference and gets people on board. Same thing with the platform technology that can hit in many different areas and do many things. Now, the difference is, I think usually here, people will have a platform technology, but then have a focused pipeline built out from the platform that can so it can actually do something. But what I see a lot of in Japanese bioventures, like people just have a platform and then that's it. And it's kind of not enough. Then he also says patent early, patent broadly. Again, protect your innovation, publish strategically. So if you can get scientific publications in the right journals, that really that helps to get the proof of concept, and that helps to validate what you have. But this last part is the one that really gets to what you're talking about, is that you build a team and you reward its members, right? And so when you reward the people that are working on this, then that's what can make the ecosystem work well. And so I think from the ecosystem perspective, maybe both the universities and the professors here, maybe they might be more aware of what's possible, right? Like they know, even if they're not profit driven, they know what it is like to do a startup, or they've heard of it, or they know what the possibility is. When I was in Boston, the TLO is very active of the technology licensing organization in the university is very active. They'll basically knock on doors looking for innovation and things that they can commercialize. So you have that going on. The university knows the value that can be brought to the university by innovating, and they push it. And then you have the professors themselves, and they know too. Now, I'm not saying I think only the very top innovation center universities in the US are like that. The average university is probably not. But the ones that are really doing it right, I think that's definitely a factor.
And also that worked for the last 2 years. I mean, regarding the COVID-19, Moderna made a big impact and saved many people, including the Japanese people too. I guess the audience, some people already got the injection of the Moderna vaccine. So that also the big impact of this kind of ecosystem. I guess that many people using like a Facebook or Google, that's okay too. But not those kind of apps don't get into the body, right?
Right.
But our ecosystem, I mean, the life science will get into the healthcare, drugs, many things will affect to the physically our body itself and the healthcare. So I think we used to, it was very difficult to explain about the impact of our activity, but now everybody already have that injected. So it's kind of easy for ourselves to explain about that. So Moderna was too big, typical, but too big example. So can I ask other examples starting from the university and from small? And by the way, we didn't have the question yet, so please type any
feel free to throw something out there
to ask Devan. So anything regarding the healthcare issues, or at least we are talking about the two big monies. But not only that, we are in Japan, we are facing the less impact of the scientific output. Of course, we have many Nobel laureates, but the output commercialization itself is not that big. So probably you may have the question about what's the difference between US and Japan or something like that. Please raise your hand or type the question in the Q&A area. Anyway, Devan, can you?
I have a slide for comparing US and Japan too. So yeah, please.
Oh, all right.
But but just briefly, if we want to run through some examples, right? Like if we're talking about university bioventures, so this is kind of the traditional model, right? There's this company, Anacor. The technology was out of Stanford and Penn State University. It's a drug that's used to treat fungal infection and atopic dermatitis, the two different drugs actually. Company was founded in 2000 and did the traditional fundraising route. So as you can see, $2.9 million Series A. These days, I think that would be in the US, that would be considered small. But when you're looking at this progression and pattern, I think this kind of matches up the current system in Japan. And they raised and raised and researched and raised and researched for 8 years. One thing to note is as they got further along, pharmaceutical companies started to invest in the later rounds. So they got their proof of concept, some proof of concept, enough to get buy-in from the pharmaceutical industry at the beginning. Then pharmaceutical companies came in later rounds, and then they IPO'd in 2010. And I don't know what the IPO valuation is, but I don't think, given the amount they raised, I don't think it's that much. But then 6 years later, as they get more progress, then they're acquired by Pfizer for $5.2 billion. And so again, this is the idea that, okay, you do an IPO to raise money, to support clinical trials, get more clinical data, and then in this case, there's an acquisition. And one reason why we like to mention this example is that we know one of the researchers who was there, and he now operates a nice restaurant in Tokyo after exiting. So that's one example of the kind of the standard way that it was done. One other example we can bring up coming out of a university is Kai Pharmaceuticals. So Daria, who's one of the founders of the Spark program that we just talked about at Stanford, which is a university accelerator. So she had actually discovered something and was trying to license it out and struggling to get buy-in from pharmaceutical companies. It's my understanding of the story. And so what they did is she made a company, like a startup, to develop the drug. That was their core technology. And then they raised Series A, Series B, and then they exited with an acquisition to Amgen. But again, this is the traditional idea, university-based technology, spin it out into a startup, and then raise money as you go, and then exit. Now, Elector is an interesting model because I think it's a bit of a hybrid. So this is where we start to talk about kind of so in this sense, instead of being driven by a professor saying, hey, I like this, I want to commercialize it, which is what happened with Kai. Here, the co-founders worked with investors to bring together multiple technologies. So there was a professor from Columbia who specialized in neuroimmunology, and then there's a professor from Dartmouth who actually had who made another company that specializes in antibodies. And so then they partnered with that company with a special antibody technology. And then the idea was to make antibody-based drugs to treat neurodegenerative diseases. But here you can see, even from the beginning, they had these top tier investors, Polaris, OrbiMed, on board from the beginning. the company was founded in 2013, and their initial funding, their first funding round was at that time, basically as they launched. They were incubated at QB3, and they received investment from Mission Bay Capital, which is that fund that I mentioned that's run by the same people who were doing QB3 and MBC Biolabs. And you can see, even when they got up to Series C, the Series C was only 32 million. So it wasn't this situation where the VC was dumping in huge money from the beginning. And it might be because this application, maybe they need more proof of concept because the neurodegenerative disease space is very difficult and almost nothing works. But eventually they got an R&D deal with AbbVie, and they IPO'd in 2019 at a unicorn valuation. And then this year they announced a partnership with GSK for developing drugs. But in this sense, it's a case where two different technologies or two different concepts were put together to make something. So that's what I want to highlight for this.
That's very interesting. In Japanese startups, probably also venture capitals don't, well, never done, or it's pretty much difficult to merge two inventors into the one company, because usually the scientific founder has a much bigger impact to the operation of the company, and then probably they don't want to work together with other professors or something. So the probably the presence of the venture capital in the management of the company could be different, right? So that you also mentioned the venture creation model that you said, right. In-house venture creation. In-house, right. Means the inside of the venture capitals, right?
Right. Which is what? Yeah. Which is yeah. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Yeah. So they know the science very well. They know the what kind of what type of the pharmaceutical company will be interested in those kind of technologies. But usually the Japanese venture capitals never talk to the scientific, the pharmaceutical people or something like that. The type of the investors difference, also the difference between the US and Japan, I guess.
Yeah, and on that end, and I think that's a great point. So I can put up a couple of examples for venture creation that are interesting from that perspective. One, Intellia, right? It's a CRISPR-Cas9 company. It's made a lot of news, famous, right? So in this sense, Caribou Biosciences was the CRISPR-Cas9 company that spun out of Berkeley, right? So the technology is from Doudna, right? The Jennifer Doudna, who got the Nobel Prize for CRISPR-Cas9. Then Atlas Ventures, which is a VC, co-founded Intellia with Caribou, which had the kind of the platform genome editing technology. And then this company would be focused on therapeutics, treating diseases. So they co-founded with the VC. And then within 1 year, in 2015, they did their Series A and Series B, and then IPO'd in 2016. So, the company's founded in 2014, IPO in 2016.
Very quick.
Right. But again, this is the interesting thing. So remember, IPO for fundraising for clinical trials, IPO valuation, 770 million. Their current market cap is almost 10 billion. I mean, I don't know how often you can see that in the mother's stock exchange in Japan, where all the biotech ventures seem to go. But they're up more in now it's 5 years. They're up more than 10 times over their IPO valuation. Now the interesting thing is so the founding CEO was from Atlas Ventures. The VC was very hands-on. And then they pulled in the founding CSO, who was the ex-CSO from AbbVie, major pharmaceutical corporate company. So they put experience, and then they were able to help shape and plan the company from the beginning. And I think that this planning aspect and having a roadmap from the very beginning is one of the reasons why when we see this venture creation model, we see these very fast exits a lot of times, not always, but quite often. Then they also brought in Novartis very early. So they had an early partnership. and then Novartis participated in their fundraising. And so what's the result? This year, this was they presented very positive clinical data for treating transthyretin amyloidosis. So they got the first ever clinical data in humans showing safety and efficacy, or at least suggesting safety and efficacy of CRISPR-Cas9 or CRISPR. So this shows how using the power of this kind of model, where very quickly deploying all of these resources, you can get to exit and then get to an actual clinical impact. So this was big news this year, their clinical trial. That we can talk about, when we talk about partnering with pharma, one thing that's interesting is how Versant Ventures partners with Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, to basically launch companies. So this has been interesting because they do stuff with iPS cells. So they did Century Therapeutics, again, pulling in technology from different places. They pulled in technology from Stanford and Harvard. Launched the company in 2018. Now the company launched with $250 million, most of it coming from Bayer, and then some coming from Versant. And actually Fujifilm was also in on that. So because Fujifilm CDI is Fujifilm stem cell company that they acquired in Wisconsin. And yep. So then they've raised again in 2021, and then they IPO'd this year with a unicorn valuation. So again, founded in 2018, IPO 2021, unicorn. So, and then the thing is with this specifically with cell therapy, manufacturing, scale up, all this kind of stuff is a major issue, where with these kinds of resources, they might be suited to be able to tackle those. Similarly, BlueRock is a company that made a lot of waves, because I think they were the first company with this kind of mega launch. So similarly, iPS cells for cardiomyocytes, heart cells, right, and neurons, or well, neural cells like neurons or glia, to treat heart disease and Parkinson's disease. So again, pulled in technology from different places, and then launched the company 2016. Again, like more than $200 million to launch. They didn't do any additional fundraising after that. They were able to proceed based on that. They actually partnered with or in-licensed stuff from, for example, a company called Ncardia that has a manufacturing platform. So they can see what problems they might have in commercializing, and then they have the resources to then go and solve those problems. And then they acquired them in 2019 at the more than $1 billion valuation. So it's an interesting model. And now they're I don't know if they've actually dosed the patients yet, but they've started their clinical trials for Parkinson's disease with iPS cells. So this kind of activity is, I think it shows how fast things can become using these new kinds of models. When you, and so the guys, so Versant put in the management. You know, I met some of the guys that were involved, and they're coming from like McKinsey or the Boston Consulting Group or those kinds of places. And then they're coming from the VC and then going in there and handling the business. So, and then just one more, if I can just do one more venture creation.
All right, last one.
Quickly, last one.
Take the questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. If questions are coming in, that's good. So obviously everybody's interested in Moderna. And so the interesting thing about Moderna, right, is so they have this core technology for mRNA, right? And their core technology for mRNA actually is how to make it so it's not immunogenic. So, which means making an immune response in the body so how to modify the mRNA molecule. And that technology was originally developed at the University of Pennsylvania. And then people in Boston took notice. And one guy who at Harvard took notice and then went to Bob Langer and said, hey, this is interesting, and maybe this can make mRNA into something. And so Bob Langer, because he's dialed in to the whole ecosystem, he had a meeting with Noor Afeyan from Flagship, who heads up Flagship Pioneering, the VC and venture studio. And the Professor Langer's idea was, well, let's use mRNA to make iPS cells. Well, I don't know, it's his idea per se, but the idea that he was pitching is let's use mRNA to make iPS cells. The VC in the meeting was like, maybe you can do a lot of other things with this. And so he said, okay, iPS cells using mRNA, maybe, but maybe there's lots of other things we should explore. So what they did is they pulled it in to Flagship Labs, which is their kind of venture studio, for several months, played with it, figured it out, kicked the tires, as they say. And within that year, the same year, then the company was founded in 2010. And then over the next 8 years, they raised a lot of money, both from venture and then almost actually as much, well, after COVID, they've raised almost as much through government grants. And then in 2018, now this is before COVID, they had the largest IPO in biotech history at a 604 million, that 7.6 billion valuation. So everyone is talking about, oh, you know, COVID made Moderna into a big deal. No, Moderna was a big deal before COVID. But it was also controversial because, you know, they've had such a large IPO, but still, I think preclinical, or at least, you know, still relatively, you know, their pipeline was still relatively early. But anyway, so yeah, so just another example of what this kind of system has made possible.
Yep. Okay, so let me summarize a little bit because for easy understanding of the audience. So we talked about the basics of the what's the ecosystem in around the Bay Area, and then get into some examples of the accelerator and also academic activity for the translational research, including Spark program, and then touch on the kind of conventional examples like Kai Pharmaceuticals and Anacor, which spent like 10 years until acquisition or IPO. The variation was 300 to like 5,000, $5 billion. And then probably the growth was very quick recently somehow, and then venture creation model was the one of the boosts to accelerate those kind of activity. So we discussed a lot of things using some examples. Okay, and then let's get into the questions. So for audience, you can ask questions even in Japanese. We still have like 10 minutes to answer questions. I'm not sure that we can cover all of them, but so far we have 2 questions. So first one is from the regarding the rare disease in the neurological diseases, and then the person will need probably like $10 to $20 million in a couple of years. Then Devan, do you think for the fundraising, US is feasible or Japanese VC is easier? Do you have any idea? The size is $10 to $20 million in a couple of years.
So this is the thing, right? If you're, and this could change, and I think that the landscape is changing, but at least traditionally, it's very difficult for Japanese VCs, or sorry, Japanese startups, especially bio startups, to raise money in the US. There are various reasons. And so what people have done is they'll either move the headquarters of the company to the US and try to make things happen in the US, which even still has mixed results. Or they'll just try and take the technology to the US and then make a US company using that technology and then have a US team handling it. And then I think there's been more success there. So I think the funding the funding round or the funding size that I see in Japan, I feel like it's increasing. Like the VC funds are growing in Japan. So hopefully, maybe it might be something that I don't know. I think, for an early, I mean, that's right now in Japan, that would be probably considered to be somewhere between Series B and Series C, right? Now, but I mean, I've seen some startups in Japan now that are coming out with like, almost $10 million for Series A. So I think it just depends, but I would say it would probably be easier to make it happen in Japan, unless you are really committed to the US and you come over here, form the company here, and really immerse yourself in the ecosystem here.
What about the growth even after that? Series B means that they need to raise the fund more even after that.
Yeah,
but
that's hard, right?
Market is not good enough. Well, probably in a couple of years, $20 million maybe okay, but like in 5 years, they need more than 50 or 100.
So I think so I think that's one case where, first of all, I think before foreign investors going into Japan for early stage, I think once it gets up to that point and they really have more proof of concept and it's really solid, it might be possible that crossover investors, like what just happened with Spiber, right? Like crossover investors from outside of Japan might actually invest in Japan. That's a possibility. And I think that people are aware, in my understanding is that people are aware in Japan also of the limitation of limited growth funding. So hopefully maybe as more capital is raised in funds in Japan, or maybe if Japanese government-backed funds are looking into trying to support growth funding, maybe it could be something that becomes possible. I don't know, but yeah, I think as of right now, yeah, I think it's difficult for exactly like you said, Tomo, for those reasons.
I see. Okay, so we have 3 more questions. So
Sure.
One is that because you're a lawyer, the person also.
I don't have my law. I have a JD, but my law license is not approved yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just graduated from law school last year. I'm a Shinji.
anyway, the person is lawyer and asking that when the bioventure startups
right. I think in this case, yeah. So sorry. Maybe I can read it because it's in English. I think.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So the question is, at which early growth phase in bioventure startups would you seek strategic advice from outside legal counsel, business and IP lawyer, or no need to seek legal help until later phases? I am a lawyer. I think immediately. So startups, because when you make the startup, you need to talk with the lawyer to make the company, and that's the business lawyer. And the IP lawyer, you're going to need it. If you're a university startup, you're going to need to work with a technology transactions lawyer and IP lawyer to figure out the licensing situation to bring the technology in from the startup. You're going to need to figure out, what to do to file your own IP, because when investors are looking at you, they're going to be looking at that kind of stuff. So immediately, one thing that's interesting in not as much for IP lawyers, but for corporate lawyers in Silicon Valley is sometimes even the really big famous firms will do deferred fees, meaning if they're working with a startup that looks like it has promise, they might say, you don't have to pay us until you raise money, or we'll do the work in exchange for equity or something like that. So sometimes those kinds of things happen too. But yeah, definitely immediately. I think startups should talk with the counsel immediately.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Okay, 2 more questions. So the person Matsumura-san is asking the success definition of the success of the startup company could be defined as IPO or M&A, and then what percentage of the startups are already succeeded? What do you think about the percentage? 1 in 10 is one general understanding, but the actual case.
Okay, so it's interesting. Now this is this is for life science, but then these are startups that were founded in earlier. so this evaluation was done in 2017. This paper came out in Nature Biotechnology recently. So I think right now the IPO market is very vibrant for biotech startups. So it might be a little bit different, but for and also this is specific for startups coming out of universities. But you can see, yeah, this is so you could see it's around 20, looks like around 23%, either IPO or M&A for startups coming out of universities. I think, if we're looking at, let's see. Yeah, if we look at I think the IPO market. I'm getting I have all this stuff in all these windows open, so I can't see what they, but let's see, where was that?
But anyway, I realized that the percentage is bigger than expected. I get
in this case, this is interesting, right? So actually COVID has really brought a lot of attention to biotech and life sciences. And so we're seeing a lot of activity, right? So, even compared to January 2020, right, the number of IPOs that closed in January 2021 increased. So there's a lot of, but anyway, but long story short, I think obviously it depends on a lot of factors. Actually, that paper in Nature Biotechnology, they looked at other factors that were involved. But just generally, from those startups evaluated from like the last 20 years and then seeing what the status was at 2017, they observed like 23% either IPO or M&A.
Okay, so it's almost time. So before closing, can you touch upon a little bit about the last question is, can you reframe about what's the difference between US and Japan in terms of the accelerator and incubator?
In terms of accelerators and incubators, I guess, let me, okay. Actually, just let me just talk generally, because in terms of accelerators and incubators, let me actually just hit the US and Japan. So in terms of accelerators and incubators, first of all, there's a lot more lab space in the US. So I think there's a lot more incubators. So there's a lot more capacity. So I think it's easier for a young startup to do experiments. So I think that's one thing. For accelerators, I think we have more of them here. I think one thing that's interesting when you look at like an IndieBio or a Y Combinator, accelerators here take equity, which is I think different from a lot of what you see in Japan. I think what they call accelerators in Japan are a lot more what we call boot camps here. And so because of that equity aspect, right, I feel like the startups in the accelerators here, it feels like they're more committed or they're more engaged in the accelerator. And the accelerator is more motivated to really, push hard. And then their relationship with the startup continues afterwards. And those accelerators have relationships with, or they have their own funds. So then they can actually provide some seed funding and follow-on funding and things like that. So I think that those are maybe important differences to look at. I think also the mentor quality is maybe different, just because I think over here there's maybe more people with experience, relevant experience. Yes. And so, yeah, I think Tomo-san has had some experiences on this end as well. Yeah, so I think that it's and so with programs like Spark, right, they say that the mentors are everything. And really what mentors can do and advisors can do for a company, not only in terms of, teaching them the secret sauce to make the company successful, but connecting them to advisors, connecting them to, parts of the ecosystem that they can use. That's also huge. And so I think that maybe that's also a plus that's provided in accelerators and incubators here. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I totally agree. And I still have many questions and comments about that, but probably that we can have more beer regarding talking about this. And okay, so I think that we already over the 5 minutes scheduled time. I'm very sorry about the poor management of the time. But anyway, I think the discussion, lecture was so great. Thank you very much, Devan, for the nice lecture, and really want to have more lectures in the future if possible. Okay, Yamashita-san, can you pass back, the ball back to you?
はい、どうも、小柳さん、デバンさん、ありがとうございました。いくらでも話せるような勢いでしたけども、申し訳ありません。ちょっと時間になりましたので、ここで、終わらせていただきます。ご案内です。次回はですね、アメリカ西海岸の10月20日水曜日午後4時半から、日本時間の10月21日木曜日、午前8時半からとなります。で、いつものようにですね、本日の録画は明日以降、メールに送らせていただきます。でまた終了後ですね、画面に本日のウェビナーに関する簡単なアンケートが流れますので、ぜひご協力ください。20秒ぐらいで終わりますので、よろしくお願いいたします。それでは本日はご清聴誠にありがとうございました。で、デバンさん、小柳さん、本当にありがとうございました。これからもよろしくお願いいたします。はい、それでは本日はこれにて終了いたします。ありがとうございました。